Sophie, welcome back to the podcast. Welcome to 2025 and Seesaw.
Hi, Grant. It is very good to be here, and actually slightly amazing to be here, all things considered, don't you think?
Well, yeah, we're certainly in a very difficult world, as Bill and I have been talking about on previous episodes, but maybe you can bring a little bit of joy to our lives through some photographic exhibitions.
Well, I certainly will give it a try. It's also, as I'm sure a lot of the listeners will know, it's been very grey, very gloomy, and spectacularly cold for the last couple of months here in London and the UK. So it's not been a terrific time for going out and seeing things. And there aren't a lot of new exhibitions on. However, there's one major new exhibition, photography exhibition, I want to talk today about. And there's another exhibition which has been on for couple of months now, which I also want to talk about. They're both on until May. As I said, they're both in London. One is very focused, one is the opposite of focused. And I think they illustrate interesting approaches to photography and interesting different uses for photography. So let's start with the new one, which is Linder, Death Came Smiling, which opened at the Hayward Gallery in London on Tuesday last week. So Linder is an artist. She is 70, although she looks maybe 40. She has been making photo montages. She's been doing it for 50 years. And this is the first major UK retrospective of her work. She's had plenty of exhibitions, but this is a retrospective of her entire career. And there is a lot of stuff in this exhibition. So, as I say, she was born in Liverpool. She studied graphic design at Manchester Poly. Her early career and student life and so on was very much dominated by punk. She was the lead singer of a punk band called Ludus, which informs her work. And I think the title of the exhibition is from the band's second album, one of the band's songs or something. Um, she met the Buzzcocks when they were starting out, that punk band. I'm sure some of you listeners are too young to know who the Buzzcocks are, but you and I know who the Buzzcocks are.
We certainly do, and we're certainly aware of that whole Manchester scene as well. So it's interesting because I saw this exhibition was on. I knew nothing about her whatsoever, other than photographer Sarah Lee. Well, this is how I found out about it. Photographer Sarah Lee was sent to photograph her for The Observer or The Guardian, and her camera flash blew up, nearly severely damaging the artist herself.
Oh, God.
That's what alerted me to the story.
Well, she's somebody, excuse me, she's somebody whose work I've known for ages, and I was very excited to see this, which is why I ran in to see it literally the day it opened. Um,
But,
so,
but Fee, where did you find out about her? Because I've got no idea about her at all.
gosh, I've known about her work for years and years and years. I
Okay.
guess it's just one of those people who, I don't know, she's been on my radar for years and years and years. She just is.
But
I
where did you see her work, do you think, prior to this exhibition?
um, well, I mean, the poster for the exhibition is the cover of the Buzzcocks album Orgasm Addict, and it's this image.
Oh, yeah.
It's this image. Everyone's seen that image. It's an image of a muscular, oiled up sort of female torso, arms above her head, but she doesn't have a head. She's an iron on top of her neck for a head, and it's a nude torso, and they're grinning mouths with big red lips positioned over the nipples. So that is the kind of image I've seen this in other places, and her work is very much along those lines.
It's really interesting, though. I mean, we're going slightly down a graphics kind of tangent here, but I always believed that that was Malcolm Garrett, who was the designer for a lot of that kind of, because he also was doing all the Manchester stuff at that time.
Well, he did the graphics, but she did the actual image making,
Okay.
the photo montage. And I think it's important to point out that there's a difference between collage and photo montage here, which she, mentions herself in the interview that accompanies the exhibition at Hayward. Photo montage is purely photography. So, as she puts it, it makes photographs tell things in a new way. It's about taking photographs, individual photographs to places that they were never meant to be,
And
is
is
the way.
she creating those photographs?
No, she is taking those photographs from other sources. And so her whole practice over literally 50 years, as I say, has been taking images from magazines. The magazines are divided into men's magazines. As she was growing up, the men's magazines, which are about cars, music, and porn, and the women's magazines, which are fashion and domestic item, domesticity. So this is where she was taking her imagery from, and still takes her imagery from. In fact, she was going to be a photographer, and she did take photographs. But one night she went to a Damned gig, Damned the pop group for our younger listeners.
I love the way you describe them as a pop group, a beat combo.
Well, the Damned were about as pop as a punk group could be.
Yeah, but of course they had the first, we're getting really tangential here, but they had the first ever punk single. They signed up for the first single,
The New
which was
Rose.
which was New Rose. Well done, Fee. We are showing our age, but also our intelligence, I'd like to think.
We are indeed. But anyway, very serious note here. She had gone to the gig to see to take photographs of the band, and she photographed the band, and then on her way home, a man followed her off the bus and held a knife to her throat. And she was obviously terrified, but she managed to persuade him to take her cameras, saying these are very expensive. My friends are going to get me. So she made it away. He didn't attack her, but he turned out he was a rapist and he had raped somebody the night before. She said she never took up a camera for until her son was born in the 1990s after that.
Wow, wow,
Yep.
what a story.
So,
But also at that time, if I look back, and I'm sure if you look back at your sketchbooks at that time, I mean, mine, which I have from those early 80s still, are full of cutouts from magazines and photo montages because it was very, very prevalent at that time. But I think it's quite a contentious issue as well because she's obviously not crediting the photographers for this work. So she's using other people's work to make her work. Is that okay?
well, considering that most of the imagery originally came from porn magazines and Playboy, a lot of the people who created the original work probably wouldn't really want their names used or credited.
Mm,
And this gives, I mean, it is a question that nowadays would obviously be a major, major consideration.
mm.
Um, but when she was making this work in the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s, it wasn't really such a, it wasn't such it wasn't a consideration in the same way that it would be now.
No, but maybe that's because magazines were so, and newspapers. I mean, if we go back to the newspapers in John Hartfield in the 1930s and so forth, there is a rich tradition of photo montage. But at the same time, I don't see a lot of photo montage work being done now by young photographers, for example.
Well, this is a good point, and she talks about um, a book called Photo Montage by a writer called Dawn Ades, and this is in 1976 how she came across it for the first time, the concept of photo montage, looking at the work of El Lissitzky, looking at the work of Hannah Hack,
Mm.
who was a Dadaist in Weimar, Germany. And so there was, and John Hartsfield, collage, all this kind of thing. So there was a lot of it around, and it became her trademark. It became the complete, all her work was basically around that. She did extend, she also has done performance art and video and so on, but photo montage is what she is very much known for. And your point about not so many young photographers doing it, there are actually a few. It is a form of illustration that you do come across in fashion, particularly these days. Um, there are quite a few young illustrators using photographic imagery to do photo montage for advertising, watch advertising, jewelry advertising, and so on and so forth these days. But one of the things that she points out that is sort of germane to your point there is that she is she was commissioned. The Hayward commissioned her to do a. So I got my. I'm turning over my notes here. I have a lot of notes on this. The Hayward commissioned her to create some new pieces specifically for the exhibition, and the piece that she particularly put together is about the fact that the week she was doing it, the UK government had just said that deep faking was going to be criminalized. And deep faking is the process of putting somebody's head on somebody else's body, basically, right? We know that. And you can have political deep fakes, you can have social deep fakes, and you can certainly have porn deep fakes. And it is a form of digital violence. So what she did for the new work is she took images of photographs of herself because she's also there is straight photography in the exhibition as well. There's photographs of her younger self, and she montaged them into centerfold, a Playboy centerfold from the month and year that the Hayward opened, um, as a new piece of work, commenting on the fact that the gender divides then have only changed form now. So you've got uh, uh, the, the 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 format is different. People aren't necessarily using scalpels and paper, but they are using computer tools to take photographs and turn them into something that the original owner of the photograph never ever intended it to be.
But you know, this is where it ties in so closely to the concerns that so many photographers have now around AI. And I have to be honest, have been saying for some time now that for me, AI is photo montage. And within photography, we don't need to be afraid of it because photography will always exist. And AI may well become another creative outlet for people who wish to use it. But I think it's very interesting in that I often think about how when you and I were at art school in the 1980s and so forth, the influence of the Bauhaus, of Russian constructivist work through people like Neville Brody, and then looking at work by Kurt Schwitters and so forth, that was a very dominant influence on us, and the Bauhaus movement, and that's very much gone out of fashion. So I wonder now if this body of work, this exhibition, which I know is getting a lot of interest,
Yeah.
whether or not this is going to make people think differently about AI and photography, but also rediscover photo montage.
I think there's two interesting points, and they're two quite separate points in some ways, because um, on the one hand, in terms of photo montage and Kurt Schwitters, I mean, as you just mentioned, love Kurt Schwitters, and I do remember when I was in art college in as you say in the 80s, we were very excited by the first time we discovered Kurt Schwitters and cutting out little bits of paper from letters from the newspaper and stuff and making our little collages that way. And I think an exhibition that's opening up next week, I think. I hope to talk about it next time, if you'll have me back again.
Of
Um,
course.
the National Portrait Gallery has an exhibition about the face magazine. Now, I think it's obviously going to be photography from the face, but I'm using it as an excuse to talk to my design students about Neville Brody and about typography and about the impact that uh, that kind of Dadaism and Weimar and Elisitsky and all the rest of them had on design in the 80s, because the way design was influenced fed into all these other things. It fed into the photography.
Yeah, exactly. And interestingly enough, on last week's episode, we had Jake Chesham, Chris Floyd, and James Dimmock, and both Jake and James have got work in that MPG exhibition of the face because they were face photographers. But I think so often it's a mistake to see photography. And I hate to say it, I think some photographers do, as being this kind of separate thing from the rest of the creative arts. And because of our background as art directors, we've always embraced illustration and typography and photography and good writing. We always saw all of those things as being as equally important to each other. So it is interesting, I think, that for photographers to actually explore areas outside of photography to understand photography a little bit better.
Absolutely. Absolutely, it is. And I think one of the fascinating things about this exhibition and this artist, Linder Sterling, is that she's incredibly well informed. I mean, I think most good artists and most good photographers and most people who are good at most things who are reasonably mature tend to be well informed generally. But her breadth of knowledge and her references that she brings into the work, and not in a ponderous way, but in kind of she knows everything about everything. She knows so many uh, names. She brings so many references into the work, and at the same time, you look at the actual work itself when you walk around the gallery is is pretty. That's one of the things about it. It's very pretty. There are her
Is
her.
is that a bad thing? Pretty sounds like such a terribly damning phrase, doesn't it?
No, it's a wonderful thing. This is the thing that I find fantastic about it too, is that you can also look back at kind of, the photo montage of the 1930s and 40s and so on, and there's a lot of caricature about it. Now, her work doesn't actually have that element. It's not caricature, even though the ideas may be, but the visuals are actually very beautiful.
But does
And
it have a political stance? Is it or not?
it's so political. It's 100% political. So what it is basically the same thing as I say for 50 years you'd be doing the same thing, which is she's making art about the uses, the way human beings are used. So it's not all, so the subjects in the exhibition aren't all female, there are men as well, but it's all about how society and porn and gender roles and so on and so forth turn people into objects. So her work is all about reclaiming not even reclaiming, but sort of pointing out how women are objectified, how sex workers are objectified, how what that objectification does to people, and how we do it all the time without even noticing that we're doing it. So it's 100% political, but 100% it's beautifully done politics.
I think this sounds like an exhibition that a lot of photographers would dismiss or think it wasn't for them. But actually, they should probably definitely go and see it, even if they absolutely hate it, because it does. We don't have to see things or get involved with things or listen to things that we like. Sometimes they're just good because they challenge us.
I totally agree. And this, when I was thinking about what to talk about today, there were a couple of other things on that I thought might be more crowd pleasy, put it like that. But I just thought, this is very good stuff. And as I said earlier, it's about what you use photography for. What are we? We're in a time where the media is changing so much and the mediums are changing so much. And as we keep talking about AI and all this, what is photography for? And
Well,
how
it needs a reason to exist. I think that's my feeling. That is, if you're going to make work, if you're going to make photographs, you need to have a reason for those images to exist, and it doesn't matter what that reason is, as long as you've got one.
Yeah, exactly. And you also have to be able to justify that reason, if not to an audience, you should be able to justify it in some way to an audience. You certainly need to be able to justify it to yourself
Yeah,
rather than just, oh, I like that, snap. I like that, snap.
yeah.
And so this is one of the things, as I say, about her work generally, that it's completely thought out. It's she has a world of photographic images, and they're not made in the traditional way. They're made in a traditional way, but they're not made in the way that a lot of photographers might think, oh yes, photography. But it's also a really well curated exhibition too. It's very well put together. Everything makes sense, and I just very much recommend it. It's great stuff.
So that's Hayward Gallery, which is down on the South Bank in London, a gallery that has had some of the most important photographic exhibitions that London has ever seen. I would argue over the years since the late 1960s when it opened, doesn't have enough exhibitions there. I think they have funding problems, but definitely well worth going to see.
Definitely. Also, just checking there, I haven't left anything out. There are things like she collaborates with other photographers within the work as well. So there you've got Tim Walker imagery that she's worked on, a Swiss photographer called Birrer and stuff. So it's 4 rooms. It's not enormous, but everything counts in it. And yes, it's a great exhibition on until May at the Hayward Gallery on the South Bank.
Great. What next?
Okay, so from the sublime to the 80s photographing Britain at Tate Britain.
Ah, now this is controversial.
It is a little controversial. So I've actually been to see it twice, because my brain, I think everybody's brain starts to spin quite quickly and takes a long time to get through it. So the 80s photographing Britain is on at Tate Britain. I think it opened in October. It certainly opened before the end of last year. It has the work of 70 photographers in it, of photographic collectives and so on. It has something like 350 works in it. So it's very big. It's very sprawling. And it starts, so to try and describe it, it starts with a room full of riots and protests. You've got the poll tax, you've got miners' strike, you've got anti-Nazi protests, and you've got great photographers in there. You've got Sid Shelton, you've got David Hoffman, you've got Brenda Prince, you've got a ton of great photographers taking great black and white photographs of mounted police charging people, and people squaring off against the police and so on. And that works really well. And I have to say, both times I've gone to the exhibition, that room has always been full of viewers. Everybody comes around. It seems to touch on everything, that room. And as I say, it's really well curated. And then you move into the next room, which has, it's about life under Thatcherism, I think is the general kind of theory. So you have some Martin Parr. You have Alice Fox. So Martin Parr doing his kind of like photographs of Tory party members at garden parties and so on, which everyone can visualize. Alice Fox, who shot offices, office culture, people carrying mobile phones the size of bricks, this kind of thing. People sitting behind desks in a very like sort of 80s corporate world. Big, bright, colorful pictures from offices. You have, in this one, you have Paul Graham, this wonderful series of Paul Graham's work called, I think it's called Beyond Caring. And it was a series of pictures he shot in places like in benefit centers and work centers where people were going to try and find jobs and so on. And there's one particular image that stopped me in out tracks. He's photographing sort of a row of people who are sitting under they're just sitting waiting to be called forward to discuss their job prospects. And one of the young men is holding a copy of The Sun, presumably, because you can see very clearly it's page 3. It's a naked woman on the page, and there's a young woman sitting next to him, sort of leaning out of the way as much as she can. And behind him, there's a sort of Dickensian, literally Dickensian caricature drawings of people who are looking over his shoulder. But it's a very strong image. There's another very strong image from that series where there's a group of people sitting in this almost deserted work center, and there's a baby, and the baby is just wandering around by itself in the middle. And there's this feeling, he says that in the 80s, he and all his friends were unemployed at least part of the time. And you have this real feeling of, you didn't know if you go to the job center for 1 hour, for a whole day, if anything would come of it or nothing would come of it. And of course, because he's in a job center, he's not allowed to take photographs of people. So everything had to be sort of from, low down, making sure that you're not being seen and so forth. So that's another room. You go into the next room, then there's a room of landscapes, and then there's a room of images involving, excuse me, images involving photographic theorists. So you have that, and then you go into another room which is all about what was it called? Let me try and find out exactly what it said. It was Reflections of, too many notebooks here. Reflections of the Black Experience. So you have this whole room that's based on um, two exhibitions, Reflections of the Black Experience, a large room. It's ostensibly tied together by two exhibitions which took place in 1986 and 1987. Very big room. And then you go on to more rooms about self-identity. There's a room full of still life by an American photographer. Um, and and yeah, who is it? Here we go. Lyle Ashton Harris. There's a wall of Wolfgang Tillmans. So it's kind of like by the time you got to this stage, you're going, where am I? What? What am I actually looking at here? I'm lost.
So is that the criticism from you? Because I've heard a lot of criticism of this exhibition, and a lot of criticism going off in different directions, which is why I was really interested to hear what your kind of big takeaway was. And it seems to me to be confusion.
It's confusion. It's I think that it starts that, and everyone I've spoken to about it says it really kind of starts with the title. I mean, the 80s photographing Britain, that sets itself up for trouble. I mean, that's a massive title. But in fact, the exhibition isn't really about Britain. It's about photographers, and it's about a development of photography in Britain. But it's not even a comprehensive development of photography in Britain. And by the way, I'm not being mean I'm trying not to be mean or horrible about it because I'm still recommending it. I still think people should definitely go and see it.
Oh, you've got to make your own mind up, that's for sure.
Exactly. Exactly. And also, the great thing about it is it's full of interesting elements. There are tons of really good photographs in it and good photographers in it.
But
There's
I
a
think, but don't you think, sorry for to interrupt you there, but don't you think that the issue here, you were talking about the Linder exhibition as to how well it was curated. And what we're talking about here is a curation that seems to be trying to do far too much. And nobody's criticizing the individual images, although, of course, subjective opinion comes in at that point. But what we're really talking about is there a cohesive narrative which is following through from room to room? And if there isn't, you are going to get lost and you're going to think, well, what are they trying to say here?
I think it's because you and I are designers as well as photography lovers, and you're a photographer. So we kind of like also like things to have a logical structure. But I think just your regular exhibition goer also likes a logical structure. So from what I can tell, having read up a bit more on the background of the exhibition, it's something that was conceived as an idea quite a long time ago, a good 10 years ago or so, by the then curator or the then new curator of photography at, I think, photography at Tate Britain, who was surprised that there hadn't been something like this, who started putting the wheels in motion for this exhibition. And it took a long time for it to come together, in the process of which this person left and is now somewhere else. So then on the looks of it, it came together by committee. And one of the criticisms leveled at it is it feels very much like this person's favorite artist and that person's favorite artist, rather than, as you say, tying it together with a narrative. And this is a funny thing, but normally, if you go to exhibitions of photography and there is a video, you can kind of take it or leave it. But when you go to an exhibition like this and there is no video of the art of any artist saying anything, I came away thinking, something, I came away both times thinking it would really help if in every room they had short interviews with the photographers or with a selection of the photographers talking about the work, their situation, they're giving it some context because, as I say, it's not about Britain. It's about photographers and photography. But the photographers and photography aren't given quite enough of a voice.
I get the feeling, and I might be wrong about this, but I get the feeling that it was trying, or it is trying, to put a sort of an importance and an academic cloak, a cloak of academy around this work to sort of, because they didn't really feel that they had the confidence in putting the show on without actually saying, but this is important, rather than just putting together a body of work. Because you and I both know that the majority of photography in the 80s, as we were just discussing, was being seen in magazines and on album covers. And actually, that was having a huge impact alongside the documentation. So in the 80s in Britain, there were two Britons. There was the job centre Britain, and there was the phrase that many people nowadays won't really understand is there was yuppie Britain. There was
Oh,
successful, moneyed, rich Britain. I mean, I started at Elle magazine in 1985, right in the middle of all of that. So we had all of that fashion and people coming out of art schools, and we had all of that, which was very much 80s Britain. But
exactly.
that's
But
been ignored.
it's like the trouble with it, those are some of the troubles with it, but the key problem with it is that there is no narrative. There are a whole bunch of different narratives. And as you say, music, fashion, magazines, tiny number of that's tiny. The representation of that is tiny. You and I and Bill were talking last time about what, catalogs coming out of exhibitions, and we said one of the things we thought is, how about postcards? And yes, I always buy postcards at exhibitions, and I bought four postcards at this exhibition, one of which is the only real representation of fashion, and it's by Jason Evans. And you're like, well, hang on a minute, what happened to all the other fashion photography from Britain in the 80s? And then they point out what happened to football and sports, what happened to celebrities of any kind. There's really none of that in there.
But I think that's very strange because Jason Evans is absolutely not the photographer that you would ever choose to represent Britain in the 1980s as a photographer. Nothing against his work, but
Absolutely.
there are other people who were much bigger kind of I suppose touchstones really as to where photography was going. I mean, Nick Knight, for example.
Well, the only Nick Knight in the entire exhibition is a copy of his book, the Skinheads book, which is like, okay, that's fine, but that's not really what we're thinking about. And there are a lot of random things in it, like there are two or three Don McCullums. You're like, okay, well, but 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 why? Why put two Don McCullums in? Why bother? And they're fine, but I mean they're lovely. There isn't such a thing as a bad Don McCullum, but they're
No,
not.
but I can remember at that time in the 80s, Don coming to see me, and Don wasn't getting any work because the Sunday Times had uh, changed. It had become a sort of lifestyle magazine, and Don wasn't creating work for quite a period in the 80s.
Yeah,
Um, so it
all right.
again, it shows lack of kind of the people putting it together are just picking names. I'm getting a little bit kind of angry about this because I think it's an opportunity missed.
It is an opportunity missed. Although, and the other thing is, you point out, yes, the 80s, he wasn't getting a lot of work. Um, the actual show includes work from 19, they call it the long 80s, 1979 to 1996.
Well, that's not the 80s.
Not the 80s at all. But you could certainly, if you're going to call it that, you could shoehorn in a few more photographers, I would have thought.
Well, also because both you and I know, and I think anybody who's really engaged in photography in Britain would know that the 90s was a period of absolute sort of change and rejection of the photography in the 80s. As again, Jake and Chris and James spoke about last week, and they were very accurate, actually. I thought it was really interesting how they said that the photographers that came through in the 90s were looking at the 60s as their template because that's the where we were all born in the 60s, and so
Yep,
we'd grown up with that, whereas the work being created in the 80s was very much the work of people who'd been to college in the 70s.
absolutely. Absolutely. And there are a lot of things that just are frustrating about it.
What a shame.
Yes, that is rather a shame. But there's a lot of good things. I mean, so as I say, it's worth going to find. You'll find there's something for everyone.
Mm.
It just takes a bit of a dig. Like for instance, there are half a dozen Tish Murtha pictures, which are just so powerful. The pathos, the depth of emotion in the faces of the people on the street that she captures are just amazing. Um, Paul Graham, of course, as I just said, that I loved his stuff. Paul Rees, supermarkets, housing estates, very saturated color. Zach Ove, I love Zach Ove's stuff. But again, there's also this weird thing, whereas in the first room you've got photography like Pogus Caesar and who else did I put in there? Um, and sorry, I'm grasping for names here. But you have photographers turning up in the same place twice, which didn't really make any sense. So yeah, there's a lot of things that just don't. They're just kind of like, well, oh, here we go. Vanley Burke and Pococy. So these are the ones I was thinking about. They appear in the first room under protest, but then they reappear in the reflections of the Black experience a few rooms later. And it's like, okay, could if these photographers' work is important, which it massively is, then why not organize it by photographer or something like that? The themes are quite unedifying in some ways. And I'm going to have to say this. I personally want to rant about one thing, which is the bit about the influence of photographic theorists and text in imagery.
Go.
I I just find it really annoying. And I know it's partly because I'm looking at it with a designer's eye, and ugly utilitarian typography stuck on a really nice photograph. It just offends me. It just reminds me of, I don't know, City Limits magazine. Now I'm really showing my age. But City Limits magazine, for our younger listeners, was Time Out Before Time Out, or at the same time, it was a sort of cheaper listings title in the 1980s. And much lamented in some ways, but it was very messy.
Well, yeah. Um, and kind of coming out of punk and punk fanzines, and we could go on and on and on about that. I think what's interesting, and I think that that room is really, I feel, kind of supporting my theory that they felt they needed to give it more academic, intellectual heft to warrant the fact of doing it. And I get the feeling that it was planned in, and then the people who took over um, then decided that they were going to turn it into what they wanted it to be, and they didn't really have the belief in what it could have been. And I think that's why it's got so much critical comment, not because there isn't good work in it, because there is, not because there aren't good photographers in there, because there are, but because the people who've put it together didn't really believe in it. And they've made a bit of a mess. And to give an entire room to that,
And
I think is ridiculous, because a general audience that we want to get excited about photography is going to get put off by that, I think.
exactly. And as I said at the beginning, when you go into the first room, it's every time I've been there, it's been very busy. There are a lot of people in that room. And then by the time you get halfway through, it's really thinned out. And I think it's because people are like, you know something, I've seen enough now, I'm going to leave. And by the time you get to the end, it's people have just gone basically. And it's a shame because some of the photographers whose work is in there um, are people who think are terrific photographers, like Karen Noor. There's a series about uh, gentlemen's clubs. And I'm just like, and it's one of the more elegant presentations in there, but I just feel it's like her work doesn't need to be presented. This is not the best way to present her work. And saying that integrating text with your images was actually the Guardian had a good way. They described it as fizzy possibilities. But my designer soul was very turned off by the whole thing. It just kind of you end up messing with good work, I think, by picking stuff that is not as good as it could be.
And
That
also trying to put themes, an opinion, a belief on something that actually either doesn't need it or isn't accurate to what you're trying to do. with the body of work because, and it will be interesting to be honest with you, and I'm really intrigued by how the NPG are going to deal with the face because I'm already hearing discussions around that particular exhibition. So I'm going to be intrigued to see how they handle it because I've got a horrible feeling that we might be in a situation with some of these large gallery museums really are dipping their toes into these areas for the sake of ticket sales
Yeah.
and actually not really believing in what they are doing, but are doing it for the wrong reasons. And there's been enough controversy around the MPG recently about the funding of exhibitions and so forth and what's being chosen. So I think this is one to keep an eye on over the coming years. What do you think?
I totally agree. I think that because the thing is, what makes a great exhibition are two things. One is great work. Two is great curation. How you put the work in, what you keep in, what you don't keep in, how you put one thing next to the other, how long it takes you to get from the beginning to the middle to the end. It's not rocket science, it's storytelling. But in this exhibition, there's a lot of great work, but there isn't great curation because it's not all great work. It doesn't hang together. It doesn't do justice to the photographers very well. One thing I would say about it is that I came away. If you want to go down rabbit holes, you can go down a lot of rabbit holes. And one of the more exciting rabbit holes for me was the poster, which we're seeing a lot around London, is from a series of photographs shot by residents of Handsworth and Birmingham, self-portraits. So they're stand-ups, they're black and white portraits, people just standing there against a white background. And the project and the kid who's on the poster, he's like leaning down, he's grinning into the camera, and everyone loves it, but it doesn't really reflect the exhibition. But the project was put together by John Reardon, Derek Bishton, and Brian Homer, who um, who kind of beginning to come onto my radar, but are now very much on my radar because they were instrumental in setting up 10/8 magazine. They have such an interesting history of work, community photography, and all this kind of stuff. And 10/8 magazine is something hadn't been on my radar until the last quite recent time. The Photographers Gallery has a tiny little exhibition about it, but now I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, this is what we need next. We need a really great exhibition that's tightly curated about how real photography made a real difference to real people's lives that just takes, a couple of rooms to do, and preferably do a book with it as well, a good book.
Well, next time you're in my office at the university, you'll see some copies of 10/8 on my desk. So you can have a look at those. Because I do think that is an interesting area around what came out of the photographic colleges, because all of those people did, it's all coming out of Derby and Trent and so Nottingham Trent and so forth, all those 1970s, 1980s educational establishments and a different way of seeing photography. And yeah, so I think that if I would to say, I think that what this exhibition at the Tate shows is if you go in with a notebook and you write down names and then you go home and you Google those names, that it's full of fantastic starting points for investigation.
Totally. My little exhibition notebook is completely full of names, dates, events, organizations that we just don't hear very much about, and you don't find much about it in there. But come home and Google it, like Pam Isherwood, Brenda Prince, Melanie Friend, Jenny Matthews, Maggie Murray, Joanne O'Brien, bunch of women there who photographed the riots and protests. Didn't know who any of them were, but I'm beginning to find out.
And that's what an exhibition can be. It can be a starting point. It doesn't have to be an end, kind of a here it is, and we walk away, we buy a t-shirt, and we forget about it. It can be an instigation for new things, and that's always good. Is that it for this week, Fiona? Or is there anything else you want to mention?
No, I'm afraid that's it for now because, as I say, there are a couple of exhibitions coming up before the end of this month, but that is it for now. They are very different. The two exhibitions that we've talked about today are extremely different, but they're both really really worth your time. They're definitely worth going to because they will open your mind in different ways. And I hope some of the listeners will go along, and I'd love to hear what other people think about them.
Yeah, as always, get in touch with us. I do highly recommend following Fee on Instagram at the Art Dictator, because she's always thinking about stuff and getting involved with stuff. Um, Fee, thank you once again. I think quite a rigorous dissection this month. I look forward to meeting up next month when it's a little bit warmer, a little bit brighter,
Mhm.
and you will be bringing us more news from the front line.
I will do my best, Grant. Thank you very much. Yes, look forward to talking to you again.